Thank you for being here, and thank you, Giuliana. Before we open to you, I want to contextualize a little bit. I mean, just the film that that's been projected, Dragon In, is it's King Hu is one of the great master of Hong Kong martial arts, and it's a movie of the mid '60s, and it's the era that Giuliana Bruno and he grew up watching movies. His relatives were his grandparents, right? Mm-hmm. They were noodle sellers, and they would take turns watching. One was staying out in the street selling noodle, and the other was the grandfather was going to watch him the film, and then the grandfather was coming out, and grandmother was going in and watch the film at some time. So I would watch the film twice a day, just stay, with each of the parents. So he knows movies very well. He loves them, and in your let's say in public intimacy, you talk about him in relationship with Andy Warhol, but also with Michelangelo Antonioni and with Jacques Tati. Yes. So can you create a little bit of an environment for us?
Yeah, well, thanks everyone for staying to the end of cinema and the kind of melancholy of the end of this particular era, and also for making it through the slow cinema effect. Simon Young is a kind of cinephile, obviously, and so this style of making films is also connected to a larger, more global kind of term in cinema, an observational cinema that is about the times of non-action, but also about urban loneliness. And so a lot of this, for example, we have seen in a different way earlier on in the 60s in the films of Michelangelo Antonioni, who spoke about a form of urban alienation or malaise that comes into a society at a moment when everything is changing. And at that time, the society was modernizing and changing. And here, it's a response in some way to the speed of change of what happens in Southeast Asia. So the more the urban environment is affected by this craze of building and changing and becoming more and more, involved in kind of capitalist speed, the more Simon Young slows himself down and slows the films down to almost moments of complete non-action. And this also, as you notice, the camera doesn't move. So in a sense, it forces you to look and to see everything that happens from foreground to the background, and on this it's long takes and long shots at the same time. And that creates almost kind of funny moments. A few people were laughing here and there, I was. And that is connected to Jacques Tati, another great master in some way of non-action. This character, think of the films that he made, Mon Oncle d'Amérique, but especially Playtime, where this is very related to me, to Playtime, the way in which Tati walks around the space, and creates gags by way of bumping into things, and then especially sound. You become very aware of sound in this film, in the same way in which you become aware of sound in Tati's films. So the sound that the women make by going up the stairs, the sound that happens in the bathroom. Everything that somehow creates a sense of, within the sadness, there's a sort of also attempt to not to be funny, but to have these moments of everyday life where you sort of see that kind of the twist of the way things turn.
Yeah, I agree. It's like if you stop panicking because nothing is happening, you just sort of assess you can see how much drama there is in every shot. When she comes in at the end and they don't meet her, she's been wandering around this labyrinth to take him the bum, and he finds it, but he doesn't find her. So, there is all this thing going on. There is the funny, there is the tragic, there is the lonely, there is the sense, there's the sense of space, and the comedy. You don't know this. Those are ghosts. The feet on the thing. So it's just also like rewiring the way we go to the movies and think, having a different perception of drama, a different notion of
drama. And
of drama.
you also mentioned Chantal Akerman in that respect. I mean, in a sense, it's also about the space and the time of everyday life where nothing really happens, and she started doing that with Jeanne Dillman, where you basically kind of watched a housewife going through her chores. And of course, during the day, she was also kind of inviting men in her house to make some money, and with the same exact attitude. Everything happens like the same thing. So she would peel the potatoes forever, and you would see how a soup is made. And with the same speed, slow speed, that you will watch her in some way making love to somebody who was coming in the room. And Tsai Ming-liang does the exact same thing. It sort of it allows you, in a sense, to enter within those times of non-action and watch the unfolding of everyday life with all its sadness and melancholy, but also places of longing for encounter. I mean, that's, when the film starts with this grand movie palace, which was probably 1,500 feet. I started counting the seats since I was kind of sitting there. So it's about 1,500, I would say, at least, though you never see it entirely, but certainly I got up to 1,500. And at the beginning, it's full. So it's this moment of grand socialization and connections, and by the time we enter the film, this is few, lonely spectators, kind of like trying to make contact, and becomes a place of cruising, but it's still the erotics of cinema. I mean, at the beginning of film was the democratic place where people actually would meet, and it was not accepted because women and men could be in the same space, because there was a kind of possibility of erotic encounters, like in the trains or in the arcades. So in a sense, it's the end of cinema, but it's also kind of transposing that possibility into this moment of attempt to have some kind of physical encounter and some sort of connection happening. And of course, it doesn't. It doesn't for the projectionist and the woman and the thing. It doesn't for anyone who's trying to cruise the bathrooms in the homoerotic thing. So it kind of leaves you with the sense of longing and for a possibility of recreating some sort of space in the city where that socialization would be possible.
And in fact, he found Tsai Ming-liang found this particular theater when he was scouting location for a different film, and he used it for a scene. And I think the owner asked him if he wanted to go to business with him and try to do something, and he said, "Well, not really, because there is no business in this, but I can rent it for 6 months or 8 months, whatever he needed." And so he filmed. He created this film around that encounter clearly, and and the cinema is since closed, and and the only people that meet are the two older gentlemen, and they are the actors of the film, and they say nobody goes to the
to the cinema. Nobody remembers them. And in retrospect, you realize why he's crying.
Yeah,
kind of watching himself, sort of being there on the screen.
Yeah, and in terms of the time, we talk a little bit more about that later. But in terms of as a generation, he's the same. He's for the generation and Ang Lee, who did Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Yeah, that was the title, which was a celebration of that martial arts cinema. But the career is completely different. In fact, Tsai Ming-liang is been taking more and more and more and more. And I want to turn it to you before we. Renee? Yeah.
It was so interesting the way this room became part of the film for me.
Yes, absolutely.
As people, every now and then, a couple of people left, the door squeaked, the light came in, someone turned on a phone, the light came, and so it was as if it was just a mirroring experience for me anyway.
So I think we were all aware of this. In fact, the first thing Julia and I said is that we only lost 2 people. It was sort of like expecting a lot more door closing and squeezing or movements of like anxiety, but it's pretty amazing how everybody.
Yeah, but it's also because the way the way investigates the space of of the cinema, and it's the space of every cinema. I mean, the projection booth. When the projection booth at Sag Harbor Cinema was just like a world in its own, because it had little posters, tickets, pieces of film. I mean, you just sort of, there is so much going on, even not in the auditorium. And the way it sort of pans through the space, as not pans, but just that doesn't pan. It just stays. Investigates that's the word. Investigates a space. It kind of takes you into the film, and you become, that audience.
Makes you think of the concession stand at the Sag Harbor Cinema too. The old one. I mean, it was kind of.
Oh yes. It was also one.
Nothing happened.
Tray napkin.
Yeah.
Well, it was also one cashier and one projectionist. That they didn't interact with each other, not because they didn't like it. It was like they were living on separate tracks. And so, other question. They had popcorn.
That's true.
No
buns.
The man walked out with a little boy because I was during the whole thing. Why did you sit next to the little boy? What's going on? Whatever went on. They didn't react. They didn't interact.
No.
He didn't acknowledge the kid. He didn't acknowledge him when he sat down. I think his grandfather.
See what slow cinema does to you. It just creates, is an activation. The idea of activating the audience. Yes.
I also found that there were parts of it where I just expected myself to disappear from it because it was getting redundant. And what I began to see was every one of those scenes literally drew me into it. I was looking at vantage points, and I kept seeing balance of light, color, the people. She was here, there was a shadow, there was dark here. It was extraordinary to me because I didn't expect to have that reaction at all. But I couldn't stop then looking for that kind of symmetry, and it was almost like comparative things going on at the same time, but there was no movement.
That's, I think, very, very true. It's part of the function of also making a deliberate attempt never to move the camera. And positioning at a particular kind of vantage point so that it allows you to do that, to see the entire thing and to look around for something and keep it there for as long as he did, so that in a sense you had no other choice but to inhabit the space and look for clues or things all around, or notice things you wouldn't. If also there was cutting, and if characters would be coming in and out, if there was editing, if there was not just movement. This really was a series of scenes that were connected to each other, but also not, in some way. And so.
Tamilia would be extremely pleased of your reaction. I have to say, one thing I deeply regret was for technical reason, all we could show was a DVD, but the film as a visual beauty that goes beyond what we saw today. In fact, he has recently restored it and is integrated it with a live performance. So now he's planning to, we premiered in Venice with the restored version with this live performance, and I think he's planning to travel that combination of theater and the film.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, we're both grateful to him because there was a moment where
they didn't want us. They said, "No, I have a restored version, and I'm planning doing my gig, and I don't want to give it to you to show, and you're spoiling this new release." And I was like, "No, don't worry. It's about saving the movie theater in Sag Harbor, So he, and this Giuliana who wrote an essay, so he finally said, "Fine,"
I think it speaks to voyeurism.
Oh yes,
The scene, when the lights are on her face when she was in the projectioner, and then just her eyeballs, like looking through the curtains, we just saw her eye, and she was always constantly watching and looking and taking it all in. And we also were watching the movie and taking me all in.
Yeah, in a sense it makes you, I mean, you identify with, not with the characters in the film, but with whoever is watching. So it really puts you in that position of almost double, voyeurism. And there's that scene you mentioned is practically one of the few times in which there is a kind of, reverse shot between her face and what's being shown on the screen. So you see this kind of identification, and she's peering through it, and the light, is on her face in an interesting way. So it's kind of about making you think about who we are as spectators, how much voyeurism there is, in a sense, in the activity of spectating, watching people who are pretending they're not being seen, right? People don't look in the camera.
Oh, it's a popular, very popular film. It was. I mean, yes, it is, and it's on. I think it was Sight and Sound a couple of years ago did a survey on the best film of history, and this was on several of them, and it was on the I think it was shown at New York Film Festival. Wendy, I think it was right. In the States, and then he had a release. It's considered a major classic. And when did you have a question?
I was wondering what you thought the significance might be of the fact that the projectionist was Japanese. Do you think there's any sort of political overtone to that?
I don't think it's the projectionist. Is the young man that walks in. That the one. No, I didn't think. I didn't.
Just had a little faint mustache, and the guy smoking a cigarette on a regular basis didn't. But they seemed like there was a confusion that they were making the same guy. But they were not.
But his line was, I am Japanese, when he said no to the man. And is there a cultural understanding of what that meant?
I mean, not the same. Not that I know in the same way. Let's say that there is tension between Korean and Japanese. If it had been that, then I would have said sure. But I think it was just another form of kind of estrangement. So the guy said sayonara, I mean goodbye, in a way like we can't even speak with each other. We're not even from the same place or race. But I don't know if there was anything else that I'm aware of other than this. I don't think so.
Not that I am. I think the notion is that is essentially a tourist in that cinema and in that community, and also there is always rain or water in Tsai Mil-liang's film. It's an essential element. So if he doesn't pour, there is something going on with water. It's a dance. Yeah. Yeah, very slow. Very, very slow.
Leon? Oh, you counted more than... Well, I got up to 15. I told you there was like a few. Thank you, though.
I was curious, it felt like the space itself becomes the film and becomes the backdrop. I feel like we saw more of that film than people in the theater saw of it while watching it. This compendium of almost shots of all of the most annoying things that happen to you when you go to the movies.
Yes.
Person sitting next to you, the shoe. I mean, and literally when the shoe drops, you know exactly what it is, even if you can't put it. Do you think there's any comments that he's saying on that aspect of social interaction that sort of in a negative annoyance way, and also in terms of this shot structure strategy, there was some things that you can't outguess him what he's doing. So when, for instance, when she's looking for the shoe and she's underneath the seat, you're waiting for the shot in which you see her come up behind him, but he immediately cuts. So, and there's a couple of times where it's subverting that type of spectator expectation of the continuity shot. Do you feel like you studied this so much more than I have? Do you feel like there's any?
No, I mean, I think everything is so deliberate. I mean, there's nothing left to chance, obviously, what he does. And so he's definitely trying to go against expectation and also expectation of when something would turn or change. You know, I feel like even at the end when the theater closes and there's nobody there and you're watching the seats, you think, okay, we're done now, and it goes on another like 30 seconds just in case you think you're over it, and it's really hard to figure out what happens between what will be the next scene. You're totally right, that follows that. And so the woman going underneath, you just imagine, there's a second when he looks around and says, what happened to her? She disappeared, right? But were they going to have an encounter? Maybe not, because he was kind of gay. There's always this kind of sense that it's going against what you might think is happening in that sense. And yes, there's every single annoying thing, but it's because you're aware of the sound, because you're in a way the camera doesn't move, the light doesn't change, so you hear the person munching against you, or the person sitting next to you, and it's not the one you desire. You want somebody else, but that whoever, and so it's this whole thing becomes. I think it's like that it becomes comic because of that sort of sense of
defied expectation, constantly defied expectation.
Yeah.
I think the woman suddenly appearing and him leaving was a description of ghosts. Ghost theater. I think that was very much
Yeah. Well, she had a very ghostly, like she was lit, very white, face, and it comes after that discussion. And also, against defies the expectation, because at that point you think, okay, this is just a place of gay cruising. And then all of a sudden the woman shows up and you go, uh-oh, what is this now? What are we doing? And where is she coming from? Or why? The ghost, yes. And so she appears and she's lit very white. There's a kind of very, very, very white light on her face.
The other thing I was going to say is that everything that happens to everyone, the few people there are in the theater, is what you do every day. You eat, you go to the bathroom, you also sleep, you put your feet up. It's very like life.
Yeah, that's the kind of the Chantal Akerman part. It's sort of, it's like the kind of cinema that she began to do, which focused on moments of everyday life, or the banality of everyday life, or the unfolding of everyday life. So making you aware of the little gestures that you do that are not cinematic. In cinema, it's very rare that you have those extended moments of the boredom of those gestures, or those things that don't mean anything in terms of major events or dramatic events. They're just part of the unfolding of everyday life. And so he follows her in that respect, I think, in continuing that line of non-action. Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. I think he's.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Just a quick observation and then a slightly less quick question, but I guess for slow style in cinema, you can't rebuke a longer question as I would love to have been in on the session during which Cy pitched this film. First he said you have to buy the rights to this classic, and it's not just 5 or 10 minutes. You have to buy the 85 minutes that I can use this film. And secondly, I'm going to lease this theater for 6 months. I don't have a screenplay. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it, but I'll come up with something. That's not an easy pitch. They must have loved him enough to just give him whatever funding that he needed. My question is spurred by something you said at the start. It set me thinking about the popularizer of Gestalt therapy in the 60s and 70s, Fritz Perls, when he spoke about dreams. He used to say, everything in your dream is you. It's not just you who have entered a big building and you feel the reverberation of your footsteps and so forth, so you should try interpreting the dream from the building's point of view, because that's also you. I'm a huge empty space. something or someone has entered me. I can feel the footsteps. I'm not exactly sure what it is. And it made me watch the film this time from the building's point of view. And it started to make a lot of sense of the lens being so still that I could see it as the walls and the ceiling. It made more sense of having less overt access to the interior of the characters, and also less dialogue. Just a building would have experienced the film-going point of view from a very different aspect. So I just wondered if you would...
No, that's absolutely the case. I mean, it's the architecture of the theater and the state that it is in that speaks. And it's interesting that the only line of dialogue is in some way talking about how the space is haunted, which in a way, is saying that the space has a life of its own, or like it's exuding a certain kind of affect, and that is what takes you on. And whatever happens is also the effect of the life of the building, or the stories that have been told there. And I mean, spaces absorb what they have been. So the life of a movie theater is something where the experience of what has been happening there over time is sedimented. I mean, it's not even in a ghostly way, but we all know when we walk into a space, we can feel, something had happened or has taken place, or there's a sense of memory that lingers in the paint that has been kind of disappearing from the walls. And so in a way, that's what he's making you aware of the history of the story, and the way also that story is fading away. And it's the story almost being told from the point of view of the movie theater, and as a kind of place of being inhabited by spectators. So
and also I think it speaks to the emotional quality of cinemas as media. That it sticks on you. It just even bad movies, they stick on you. You take them home and you're like like 6 months later you're like, oh God. It's a very emotional. It's a medium of emotion, and so they keep existing in the space. And that's why I think his argument of taking more than adding to the drama, to the characters, to the acting. He loves Buster Keaton. So, it's just no expression. It makes an argument by just taking away, because there is so much there that's already there that you don't have to add. And I think
you had something about how he pitched this film and how he got it made. Well, I mean, all his films are like that. So he must have had, he must have been able to do this. I mean, if you think about any of his films, I mean, there's one called The Hole, where the whole point of it is just there's like a hole in the ceiling and there's a leak, so you could just imagine him going in and said, I want to make a film about like a hole and a leak. or Vive l'Amour, which actually won Venice, was...
And Stray Dog won Venice,
and was a kind of film about an empty apartment that at different times people come in, but they never even meet or encounter each other. I mean, try to kind of pitch that kind of a film.
And to your excitement, he's been taken away even more. But his films are all like this. He owns them, so you go to him if you want to show his films, and then he licenses them. This was out on DVD in the U.S. at some point, but now the rights are back. But it's been taken away even more. And interesting, and I think that there is a financial reason. He's been moving more towards the world of the of visual arts, which has more money for things where nothing happens. No offense to the visual artists, but there is a financing dimension to the fact that he is now doing films which are mostly shown in museums, and they are very, very close to installations. And
I mean, they basically are, like he's been doing now a series of things called walkers, where just as a very slow Buddhist monk that walks, through the thing. And then it's one thing to show something like that in a movie theater. It's another thing to have it in an art gallery, where, in a sense, you expect, that kind of moving image situation. And you also have the possibility of moving around, sort of entering and exiting at whatever time you want. There isn't the same kind of idea of sitting down and watching beginning, middle, end, and that sense of duration that is been extending is actually very well suited to the art gallery. I also think there's another reason that's less financial, but that has to do with the fact that the art gallery has become the social public place. That in a sense has become the place that has replaced, to a certain extent, the movie theater as the site where people go and encounter with each other. And I mean, think about museums today. I mean, they were supposed to be mausoleums, but they're like full of people and they're full of moving image installations. And so a lot of artists like Chantal Akerman, like Kiarostami or Peter Greenaway or Tsai Ming-liang are also, have also been freely moving between the movie theater and the art gallery, and especially, those I mentioned whose films are, in a sense, about more suited almost for that possibility of not having to have the chains of the narrative or of the plot, but being able, in a sense, to do more observational, extended, outlook on moments in life. And so Tsai Ming-liang is following, in the footsteps of Chantal Akerman in some way, or Greenaway, or Trint Mina, or many of the filmmakers who have started to make moving image installation, partly because they can actually, do it financially, and partly because they probably enjoy the possibility of having that capacity to recreate a social space or a public space without the constraints of having to make a feature film that has a kind of narrative that they have to sell in that respect, in the way, you were saying he would have had to pitch it. It's a lot easier to, to do that in a museum. No one is going to ask you how it begins, how is the middle or the end, what kind of narrative it has. It's as long as you can demonstrate having a concept and a capacity to do it.
That said, we in Venice we have a very strong relationship with Tsai Ming-liang. We show several things, but there is always a concern. It's like a 1,200 seat theater. It's like a movie palace. You're like, how do we? Can it sustain it? Can are we gonna not fill it, but are we gonna have like 3 people? And he has an audience, and there's a very loyal audience. It's an abundant audience, and so it speaks here. It was Stray Dogs was, 4 or 5 years ago, he won the Golden Lion. So not only, he is current and beloved by a relatively big group of people that still, that do enjoy watching films in theater. And this is clearly something that you want to watch in a movie theater.
Yeah, I invited him to Harvard twice, and in the early 2000, right? And the first time I was also worried. The theater is not that big, but it's 300 seats, and I thought, oh my God, should I force my students to come, and then they're gonna hate me, or It was so packed, and it was packed with people that usually don't go to the Harvard Film Archive. I mean, it had a kind of huge following also in the Asian, and it changed the entire way in which the archive was really dealing with what is possible to show, and then he came and pretended not to speak a word of English, although I'm sure he did. but just to make the conversation even slower, he forced me to have a translator in between.
I think we've time for one. Yeah. We've got 2. Yeah, 2. Okay. I think one of the things that movie is about is the contrast between reality and fantasy. So that all of those sounds, all of that bathroom stuff, all of those little things that get extended out are the reality of everyday life. But the movie is fantasy. And that's one of the reasons that people go to movies, is to enter into a fantastical world that's not their own. And we ourselves are also projectors. We project the meaning onto many of these things. So it's about many, many different things. You mentioned reverie early on. The source word, French dream. And in a way, we all dream, we all project onto our dream screen, which is really what it's called.
Yes, it's like when anything, yes, of course.
So there's so much in this film, if one really thinks about it.
Of course.
So much to appreciate.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
One there and then.
Yeah, you're bringing up this issue about the transition of certain creative moving image makers from working for the cinema theater to galleries is an issue that's sort of very present to me. And I wonder, and actually goes with what this lady said behind me about the whole question of going into a separate, more oniric space, which I think doesn't happen when you see a work in a gallery where the lighting is not as dark usually, where you also walk in and walk out very easily. You kind of sample the thing rather than really watch it. Very often you stand. Usually there's not seating, and also the sound is often atrocious in art galleries. How do you feel on a kind of bigger picture about?
Well, first of all, that depends on the gallery or the museum space. I mean, actually, a lot of moving image installation artists think very deeply about this issue, and some of them actually constructed different kind of seating. I was thinking of like Kito Sterol. There's a number of people who actually kind of, make a play between the type of seats or the type of leisure, and some of them actually would have you kind of lie on the floor or project things on the ceiling or on walls or in different kinds of spaces, and not necessarily, you're not necessarily just. I'm watching it this more and more. I think at the beginning of the 90s, when this phenomenon started happening, you were correct. People came in and out, but now more and more so, people actually stay. They want to stay. They don't move. And more of these are becoming, if not small movie theaters, but a version of a kind of space in which you lose yourself, in which you actually sit in different ways, or even lie down, or come for a while. Or think about Pipilotti Rist in the middle of the Museum of Modern Art. People were lying there just for hours, watching this kind of grand circular thing going around. So and there is it's also the space of sociability, the idea of the possible encounters. I'm also thinking of Christian Marclay. The idea of like a 24-hour, kind of experience of a film, which is made of 2,000 clips of films together, which are about time, and each one of these little clips is about a certain moment in the time of a day, and it was shown to be watched for 24 hours, and people went in, but they went in for chunks of time, and then they returned to watch another thing, and it was incredibly successful. So it really makes me think that the fluidity is there, and you're also rediscovering something in different ways by having this. I don't find it to be a lesser substitute. I find it to be actually a way to reimagine and rethink what projection is and what it means. It also articulating the capacity of the screen, and not just to be fixed and not just to be rectangular. Something about expanding that space of projection, and also being aware of the projection itself, of the light, of the way in which it crosses the space, being able to see the other side of the screen. There's a number of things that you can do in a gallery space that actually enhance the capacity and the possibility of that projective experience that you were talking about, of the dream screen being something else or something more than just this place in which you are chained to the chair. So in a sense, to me, it's changing from being Plato's cave, from being this place in which the spectator is a prisoner of the cave, sitting in the dark space, looking at the illusion on the screen, into another form of projection that perhaps comes from a different type of model, and that allows you to still have that experience of projecting yourself not just into the character, but projecting yourself into the space, in a way that the space itself, the space of the screen, the space of the gallery, the entirety of the space itself can become projective. And so, to me, it's actually expanding the form and not contracting it. Yes?
The sound. Was there a special sound person? Does he do his own sound? It's extraordinary. I mean, it's like a musical soundtrack to a musical without music. Do you know whether they had any special equipment to do that, or whether he supervises that, whether he uses the same guy? I mean,
I don't know specifically, the instrument he uses, but sound has always been one of his big things. He works with a very small group of people, very loyal. He's almost down to one actor now, and and so it's like a perfected thing. But sound has always been, one of his things. Yeah.
Do you see this being carried forward in virtual reality? I mean, the more you talk about it, the more it sounds like...
He's done one.
Yeah. He's done a VR piece, yeah.
He's done a VR
the longest VR piece that's ever been made. It's the longest VR piece.
Yes, yes, I'm sure. and yeah, he did a VR piece, and then I think in response to that, then he made a piece called Face, because one of the things he was frustrated by in VR was the difficulty doing close-ups, and so then he did a whole exploration of the face. Yes, but obviously this is going, I mean, it makes perfect sense, that given his interest in exploring all the different possibilities, that he would think about VR and the fact that, in VR you just don't have the frontality, but it's your entire body and your whole relation to the immersiveness to the space that becomes important. So, yes.
And Face was a study on face. I mean, it was simply a set of a certain amount of people given all the same amount of time to be in front of the camera. And they could choose to do anything, some of them still, some, so and it was a study on detail and incredibly dramatic, but nothing happening.
A bit like Andy Warhol. I mean, it goes back to goes all the way back to to the idea of art film, or the connection between an artist making film and this. I mean, Warhol used the camera in practically exactly the same way by doing a number of studies of face or people sleeping or doing nothing. And so this is really in some way also going back to this idea of slow time, but actually even like real time. I mean, if you think about it, Warhol is the one person who's made a film that actually lasted the entire time of everyday gesture, like Sleep, the person sleeps 8 hours, or Empire, 24 hours of the cycle of light changing on this building, so the actual life of the building in light with nothing absolutely happening. And the screenshots that he did were the similar kind of thing. It's almost going back also to the beginning of cinema, to the discovery of the face, to the idea that you could actually, for the first time, I mean, think about it, it's only in the mirror you could see yourself, right? And so this medium comes up, and all of a sudden, wow, you have this enormous face, and you can explore it like a landscape. The face becomes a landscape when it's a big close-up, and so in the same way you could kind of see all the different things changing around. And so it's almost going back to the primitive attraction in some way of the cinema, to be able to be attracted by life itself.
Well, I think this is an ideal way to close, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Giuliana, for the extremely rewarding conversation and presentation. And come next Saturday at 6 p.m. at Pearson for a completely different film, Sullivan's Travels, and our guest will be Laurie Anderson.